$800,000. That is not a small number. That is decades of work, decades of sacrifice, and by almost every retirement calculator on the internet, that sounds like enough. So when I tell you that the couple I'm about to walk you through today, watch that money disappear faster than they ever imagined. I don't want you thinking this is a story about people who were reckless or irresponsible or clueless. They weren't. They planned for retirement. They saved consistently for almost 30 years. They stayed out of debt. They invested. They did what every financial expert tells you to do. And they still got it wrong. Not because of one catastrophic mistake, because of six perfectly reasonable decisions that slowly stacked on top of each other until the retirement they imagined started slipping away. If you're within 10 years of retirement, or you've already retired, I want you to pay close attention because every mistake we're going to cover today is one that felt completely logical when it happened. And before we start, one quick disclaimer. Gary and Carol are a composite couple created for educational purposes. Their story combines patterns that financial planners, retirement researchers, and retirees see over and over again. This isn't financial advice, and your own situation will be different. So always talk with a qualified financial professional before making major retirement decisions. Now, let's get into it. Meet Gary and Carol. Gary retired at 62 after spending nearly 3 decades in manufacturing management. Carol worked part time while raising their children before returning to full time work in her 50s. Together, they accumulated about $800,000 spread across a traditional 401k, a Roth IRA, and a taxable investment account. Their mortgage was gone. No car payments. Very little debt. Their household expenses averaged around $5,500 a month. On paper, everything looked solid. They planned to follow the famous 4% rule. 4% of an $800,000 portfolio gives you roughly $32,000 per year. Add Gary's Social Security benefits, trim a few expenses, and retirement looked completely manageable. If you had looked only at the spreadsheet, you probably would have congratulated them. The problem is, retirement doesn't happen on spreadsheets. It happens in real life. And real life has a way of exposing assumptions you didn't even realize you were making. The first one showed up almost immediately. Mistake number one. They claimed Social Security too early. Gary became eligible to claim Social Security at 62. His full retirement age, however, was 67. If he had waited until 67, his monthly benefit would have been around $2,400. Instead, he claimed at 63. His monthly benefit became roughly $1,680. That's about a 30% reduction. And here's the key point. That reduction isn't temporary. It isn't something that disappears once you reach full retirement age. It's permanent. Every single monthly check for the rest of his life is based on that lower amount. Now, before anyone says, well, obviously that was a bad decision, I want to slow down because this decision actually made perfect sense from Gary's perspective. He had just retired. His paycheck had stopped. He looked at his retirement accounts and thought, why should I withdraw another $1,600 every month from my investments if Social Security is available? On the surface, that's reasonable. In fact, it's the exact argument millions of Americans make every year. And to be fair, there are situations where claiming early absolutely makes sense. If someone has significant health problems, if longevity doesn't run in the family, if immediate cash flow is more important than maximizing lifetime benefits, claiming early can be the right move. The break-even point for delaying benefits usually falls somewhere around ages 78 to 80. If you don't expect to live that long, taking benefits earlier may actually produce more lifetime income. So this isn't about saying everyone should delay. That's too simplistic. Gary's mistake wasn't claiming early. His mistake was only thinking about himself. He never modeled what would happen if Carol outlived him. And statistically, that's exactly what often happens. When one spouse dies, the surviving spouse generally receives the larger of the two Social Security benefits. That survivor benefit depends heavily on what the higher earning spouse claimed. So imagine Gary dies at 74. Carol lives until 88. Instead of receiving a survivor benefit based on a $2,400 monthly payment, she's receiving one based on $1,680. That's about $720 less every month. Nearly $8,700 less every year. Across 14 years, you're looking at well over $120,000 in reduced survivor income. Depending on annual cost of living adjustments, that lifetime difference can grow dramatically. That's a huge amount of money. And here's the part that really bothers me. Almost nobody talks about this. Most conversations around Social Security focus entirely on maximizing your own lifetime benefit. Very few people stop to ask what happens to the surviving spouse 20 years later. That omission can completely change the calculation. Gary wasn't trying to maximize income, he was trying to protect his nest egg. Ironically, by trying to protect it, he permanently reduced one of the safest sources of lifetime income his household would ever have. Nobody pointed that out. Nobody walked through the survivor math. And once the paperwork was filed, there was very little room to undo the decision. Mistake number two, they budgeted for healthcare, but used the wrong number. Healthcare was the next surprise. Gary retired at 62. Medicare doesn't begin until age 65. That left a 3-year gap. They knew they needed health insurance. They didn't ignore it. They actually included it in their retirement budget. Their estimate? About $800 per month for both of them combined. It sounded reasonable. They had searched online. They found articles discussing average premiums. They assumed they had a decent cushion. Then they started shopping for actual plans. The real number came back at roughly $640 per month, not $1,640 each, combined, but still more than double what they expected. And remember, that was before deductibles, before copays, before prescriptions, before unexpected medical visits. Just the premiums alone added roughly $840 every single month to their retirement budget. Multiply that over 3 years before Medicare eligibility, and suddenly they're pulling around $30,000 more from savings than they ever planned. That's not because they made reckless healthcare decisions. It's because they planned using averages instead of their actual circumstances. This is something I see constantly. People search average health insurance premium. They find a national number. Then they build an entire retirement plan around it. The problem is national averages are almost useless for retirement planning. They include younger workers, people whose employers subsidize premiums, individuals receiving different levels of government assistance, different states, different markets, different ages. A healthy 28-year-old buying insurance is not in the same universe as a retired 62-year-old shopping on the individual market. Insurance companies are allowed to charge older adults substantially more than younger adults for the exact same coverage. Your age matters. Your income matters. Your state matters. Every one of those variables changes the final price. That's why using an average can create a retirement budget that's off by hundreds of dollars every month. And that's exactly what happened to Gary and Carol. The frustrating part is this mistake was completely avoidable, not by delaying retirement, not by cutting spending, simply by getting an actual quote before making a life-changing decision. 10 minutes of research with real numbers would have exposed a gap that eventually cost them tens of thousands of dollars. Unfortunately, by the time they discovered the true cost, they had already retired. And then, before they even had time to adjust to those higher healthcare expenses, something else happened that they couldn't control at all. The market turned against them. Mistake number 3, the market dropped at exactly the wrong time. This is probably the least understood risk in retirement. It's called sequence of returns risk. The name sounds technical. The idea is actually very simple. Imagine 2 retirees. Both start with exactly $800,000. Both average the exact same annual investment return over the next 25 years. Both withdraw the exact same amount of money every year. By every normal measure, their retirement should look identical. Except it doesn't, because one person gets the good market years first. The other gets the bad years first. And that one difference changes almost everything. Let's use Gary and Carol. Suppose the market had climbed 20% during their first year of retirement. Their $800,000 portfolio would have grown to roughly $960,000 before they even made a withdrawal. Now imagine they withdrew $33,000 to cover living expenses. They'd still have about $927,000 invested. The following year could even be mediocre, and they'd still be in great shape. Now flip the order. Instead of gaining 20%, The market falls 20% during that first year. Now their portfolio drops from $800,000 to around $640,000. Then they still need to withdraw about $33,000 because the grocery store doesn't care what the stock market did. Now they're down to roughly $607,000. Here's where the damage really begins. Every dollar they withdraw during that downturn is a dollar that's no longer invested when the recovery eventually comes. Those dollars don't get to participate in the rebound. People often assume that if the market eventually recovers, retirees recover too. Not necessarily, because retirees are taking money out while they're waiting for that recovery. That's what makes the order of returns so important. Average returns tell only part of the story. Timing matters just as much. And unfortunately for Gary and Carol, their timing couldn't have been much worse. They retired in late 2021. Then came 2022. Stocks fell sharply. Bonds, which are normally supposed to cushion declines, also had one of their worst years in decades. Diversification still helped, but it didn't provide the kind of protection many retirees expected. Now, here's something important. Gary and Carol didn't panic. They didn't sell everything. They didn't move all their investments into cash. They didn't make emotional decisions. Behaviorally, they actually did almost everything right. And yet, they still suffered the consequences of retiring into a major downturn. That's why sequence risk is so dangerous. It's one of the few retirement risks that can hurt you, even if you stay disciplined. Their original plan assumed something close to a 4% withdrawal rate. After the downturn, that margin became much thinner. Instead of comfortably withdrawing around $32,000 a year, they were suddenly looking at something closer to a 3.2% sustainable withdrawal rate if they wanted the same long-term probability of success. That doesn't sound dramatic, 3.2 instead of 4. But let's translate it into real dollars. On an $800,000 portfolio, that's about $25,600 instead of $32,000. That's roughly $6,400 less spending every year. Every year. For the rest of retirement. Think about what $6,400 actually represents. It's vacations. It's home repairs. It's replacing a vehicle. It's helping grandchildren. It's simply having breathing room. That's the hidden cost of retiring into a bear market. This is also why I get nervous when people rely entirely on simple online retirement calculators. Most of them assume average returns spread smoothly across time. Reality doesn't work that way. Markets aren't polite. They don't alternate between good years and bad years on a predictable schedule. Sometimes you retire into a decade-long bull market. Sometimes you retire 1 month before everything falls apart. Your retirement plan needs to survive both. If you've never stress tested your retirement using a scenario where the market falls 20 or 25% in your first year, you don't really know how resilient your plan is. That's not being pessimistic. That's being prepared. Gary and Carol learned that lesson the hard way. Mistake number 4. They spent more after retirement, not less. There's a piece of retirement advice you've probably heard countless times. You'll spend less once you retire. No commute. No expensive work clothes, no payroll taxes. Maybe the mortgage is gone. Maybe the kids are financially independent. Expenses naturally fall. It's one of the most common assumptions in retirement planning. And for many retirees, eventually, it becomes true. The problem is that it often isn't true at the beginning. Gary and Carol actually spent about 18% more during their first year of retirement than they had while they were working. Not because they suddenly became irresponsible, because they finally had time. Time changes spending habits. When you've spent decades saying, we'll do that after retirement, retirement becomes one long list of delayed dreams. They traveled more. Not extravagant luxury trips, just the kind of vacations they'd postponed for years. They started eating out several times a week because cooking every day didn't feel much like retirement. Carol had always wanted to update the kitchen. Now they were home every day looking at it. It bothered her even more. So they renovated. Their daughter was buying her first home. They wanted to help. They gave more than they originally planned. None of those decisions were irrational. None of them were reckless. Each one made perfect emotional sense. That's what makes this mistake so common. Retirement isn't simply the absence of work. It's the beginning of a completely different lifestyle. And different lifestyles usually come with different spending patterns. Personally, I think one of the most misleading rules in personal finance is the idea that everyone only needs 70 to 80% of their pre retirement income. That statistic works across millions of households. It doesn't necessarily work for yours. The first 2 or 3 years of retirement often become what I call the retirement honeymoon. People travel, they renovate, they visit family, they buy the RV, they take the cruise, they join the golf club. They finally start doing everything they postponed while working full time. That's completely understandable. But it also means spending frequently rises before it falls. If your retirement plan assumes expenses immediately decline on day one, there's a decent chance you're setting yourself up for disappointment. Gary and Carol didn't budget for the retirement honeymoon. So instead of easing into retirement spending, they accelerated withdrawals during exactly the same period their investments were already under pressure from a declining market. On their own, none of these mistakes would have destroyed the plan. Together, though, they started reinforcing each other. Higher healthcare costs required larger withdrawals. The bear market reduced the portfolio faster than expected. Higher lifestyle spending increased withdrawals even more. Then came another mistake that made all of those withdrawals even more expensive than they needed to be. It wasn't about how much money they withdrew, it was about where they withdrew it from. Mistake number 5: Gary had a retirement plan, but not a life plan. This is the mistake that surprised me the most. 6 months after retiring, Gary wasn't worried about money. He was worried about purpose. For almost 30 years, work gave him structure. It gave him routines, friends, goals, a reason to get up every morning. Then overnight, all of that disappeared. Without realizing it, he started making financial decisions out of boredom instead of necessity. The kitchen renovation happened. He gave more money to help family than he'd originally planned. He checked his investment account several times a day, letting normal market swings affect his mood. Retirement isn't just about replacing your paycheck, it's about replacing your purpose. People spend decades planning for their last day at work. Very few spend time planning for their first Monday afterward. And that can become surprisingly expensive. So, where did Gary and Carol end up? They're okay. They're not broke. They're not facing financial disaster. But 6 years later, their $800,000 portfolio has fallen to roughly $560,000, and they're withdrawing money faster than they originally planned. The comfortable margin they thought they had is gone. And it happened because of 5 ordinary mistakes. They claimed Social Security too early. They underestimated healthcare costs. They retired into a market downturn. They spent more during their retirement honeymoon than they expected. And they never planned for what retirement would actually feel like. None of these mistakes are unusual. They're exactly the kinds of mistakes reasonable, responsible people make every single day. If there's one takeaway from this entire story, it's this: retirement isn't won by reaching a certain dollar amount. It's won by preparing for everything that happens after you reach it. If you found this useful, subscribe, because in the next video, we're tackling one of the biggest retirement debates of all: whether waiting until age 70 to claim Social Security is actually the smartest move, or whether that's advice that only works for a very specific group of people. I'll see you in the next one.